The rain had not stopped since morning, and Daniel Hart stood at the edge of the grave with mud soaking through his shoes, unable to feel the cold anymore. Around him, 30 or 40 people stood under black umbrellas, but he barely saw their faces. His grandmother, Margaret Hart, was being lowered into the ground, and the only person who had raised him after his parents died was now gone forever. He had rehearsed 100 times what he would say at this moment, but standing here now, every word disappeared from his mind. The priest spoke slowly, his voice blending with the sound of rain hitting umbrellas. Daniel stared at the wooden casket, remembering the last time he had held his grandmother's hand in the hospital. She had been so small by then, so quiet, nothing like the strong woman who had taught him to ride a bicycle and to cook rice without burning it. He had promised her he would be fine. He had promised her many things. It was then that he noticed her. A young woman stood near the back of the crowd, half hidden behind a tall man in a dark coat. She was crying harder than anyone else there, her shoulders shaking, her hand pressed against her mouth as if she was trying to hold in a sound too painful to let out. Daniel did not recognize her face at first. Then it came to him slowly, like a memory surfacing from deep water. She was the hospice nurse, Elena. Elena Marsh had come to their house every day for the last 6 weeks of his grandmother's life. She had given her medicine, changed her bedding, read to her in the evenings when Daniel was too exhausted to speak. He had seen her almost daily, yet he realized now that he barely knew anything about her beyond her name and her gentle voice. Why was she crying like this? Why was her grief this deep for a woman she had only known for such a short time? Daniel found himself staring at her through the rain, unable to look away. There was something about the rawness of her sadness that did not match the professional distance a nurse was supposed to keep. It was as if she had lost someone from her own family. The priest finished his final words and stepped back. The funeral workers began to lower the casket into the ground, and someone handed Daniel a handful of dirt to throw onto it, as tradition required. His hand shook as he took it. He looked at the earth in his palm, then at the grave, then, without meaning to, at Elena again. She met his eyes for just a second before looking away, embarrassed, as if she had been caught doing something wrong. But in that second, Daniel saw something he could not explain. Recognition. Not the recognition of two strangers who had crossed paths at a hospital bed, but something deeper, something that made his chest tighten in a way grief alone could not explain. He dropped the dirt into the grave. The sound of it hitting the wood was heavier than he expected, and for one moment, the whole world seemed to go silent except for that single sound. After the ceremony, the crowd began to disperse in small clusters, offering their condolences, hugging him, telling him his grandmother was in a better place now. Daniel nodded and thanked each of them, but his mind kept drifting back to Elena, who was now standing near a tree at the edge of the cemetery, alone, wiping her eyes with a tissue. He excused himself from a conversation with his aunt and walked toward her, unsure of what he was going to say. "Elena," he said softly when he reached her. She looked up startled, her eyes red and swollen. "Daniel, I am so sorry. I did not mean to intrude. I just wanted to pay my respects." "You are not intruding," he said. "She cared about you a lot. She mentioned you almost every day near the end." Elena's face changed at these words, something flickering behind her eyes that Daniel could not quite name. Grief, yes, but something else too. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "She was a remarkable woman," Elena said quietly. "I have taken care of many patients in my career, but she was different. She spoke to me like I mattered, like I was not just someone paid to change her bedsheets." Daniel felt his throat tighten. She had a way of making everyone feel like that. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain now reduced to a light drizzle. Around them, the last of the mourners were leaving, their cars pulling away from the cemetery one by one. Daniel knew he should go back, that people were waiting for him, that there were things to be done, arrangements to finish. But he could not make himself walk away from her. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. Elena nodded, though her eyes carried a flicker of hesitation. "Why does this feel like more than just losing a patient to you? I am not trying to be rude. I am genuinely asking." Alina looked down at the wet grass beneath her shoes. For a long moment she said nothing, and Daniel wondered if he had crossed a line he should not have crossed. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your grandmother and I talked about many things in those last weeks. Not just about her illness, about life, about family. About things I had never told anyone else." She paused, swallowing hard. "She reminded me of my own grandmother who passed away when I was very young. I think, somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing her as just a patient." Daniel felt something shift inside his chest, a strange mixture of sorrow and warmth. She had that effect on people. "She talked about you constantly," Alina said, a small, sad smile crossing her lips for the first time. "She was so proud of you. She said you worked too hard and slept too little, but that you had the kindest heart she had ever known in anyone, including your grandfather." Daniel let out a short, surprised laugh, the first sound of lightness he had made all day. "That sounds like her." The wind picked up slightly, scattering a few loose leaves across the wet ground. Daniel glanced back toward the grave, now half covered by the cemetery workers, then back at Alina. Something about this moment felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed down to let him notice things he would otherwise have missed. The way Alina stood with her arms wrapped around herself, not from the cold but from something heavier. The way her eyes kept drifting toward the grave, as if she was saying goodbye to more than just a patient. "She told me something else too," Alina said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly. "Something I did not know how to respond to at the time." Daniel's heart began to beat a little faster, though he could not explain why. "What did she say?" Alina hesitated again, glancing at him briefly before looking away. "She said she hoped I would take care of you after she was gone. She said it more than once, actually. I thought she was simply asking me as her nurse to check on the family, but the way she said it felt different, more personal." Daniel felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, cutting through the numbness of the day. He thought about his grandmother's final weeks, how she had grown quieter, more reflective, spending long hours simply watching the world outside her window. He remembered catching her smiling once, for no reason he could see, and when he had asked her why, she had simply said, "Some things fall into place exactly when they are supposed to." He had not understood what she meant then. He was beginning to understand now. "She was not wrong about many things in her life," Daniel said softly. "I have learned to trust her instincts, even when I do not understand them myself." Alina looked at him then, really looked at him, and something passed between them that neither of them could name out loud. It was not romance, not yet, not in any way either of them would have admitted. It was something quieter than that. A recognition. A sense that they had both just lost the same person in different ways, and that the loss had somehow tied them together. The cemetery workers finished their task, and the grave was now fully covered, a mound of fresh earth marking the place where Margaret Hart would rest. Daniel looked at it one last time, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him like a physical thing. "I should go," Alina said quietly. "Your family will be waiting for you." "Wait," Daniel said before he could stop himself. He did not know what he wanted to say next. He only knew that letting her walk away right now felt wrong, like leaving something unfinished. Alina turned back to him, waiting. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. He looked at the grave, then at her, then back at the grave again. And in that moment, standing in the wet grass beside the woman his grandmother had spoken of with such quiet certainty, something inside him shifted. He thought about all the promises he had made to his grandmother over the years, promises to take care of himself, to find happiness, to not let his grief consume him the way it had after his parents died. He thought about how she had never once given him advice that turned out to be wrong. "Thank you for being here," he said finally, though it was not what he had meant to say. Alina gave him a small nod, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. "She meant a great deal to me, Daniel. I hope you know that." "I do," he said. "I think I understand more than you realize." She turned to leave, taking a few slow steps across the wet grass toward the cemetery gates, and Daniel watched her go, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside him. It was not grief, though grief still sat heavy in his chest. It was something else entirely, something that felt almost like the beginning of a question he did not yet know how to ask. He looked down at the fresh grave one last time before turning to follow the rest of his family back to the cars. The rain had stopped completely now, and a thin ray of afternoon light broke through the clouds, falling across the wet grass in a pale golden line. Daniel did not know it yet, but this day, this rain, this grave, and this woman walking away from him across the wet cemetery grass would become the beginning of the most unexpected chapter of his life. A chapter that would test his patience, his faith, and his understanding of what it truly meant to keep a promise. For now, all he knew was that something had changed. Something in the quiet space between grief and hope had shifted, and he could feel it settling into his chest like a seed waiting for the right season to grow. As he walked back toward his family, his eyes lingered once more on Alina's retreating figure, and a strange, unexplainable certainty rose within him. He did not understand it yet. He would not understand it fully for many months to come. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the sorrow of burying the only parent he had ever truly known, a single thought had planted itself, quiet and unshakable. This was not the last time he would see her. He was right, but he had no idea just how long and how painful the road back to her would be. The following morning, Daniel woke up in his grandmother's house, surrounded by the silence that only comes after a funeral. Relatives had stayed the night, sleeping in guest rooms and on couches, but by mid-morning most of them had begun packing their things, preparing to return to their own lives, their own responsibilities. Daniel envied them in a strange way. They could return to normal. He no longer knew what normal meant. He wandered through the house that had raised him, touching the familiar objects that still carried traces of his grandmother's presence. Her reading glasses on the side table, her favorite blanket folded neatly on the armchair, the smell of her perfume still lingering faintly in the hallway. Every corner of the house whispered memories he was not ready to face alone. It was in the kitchen, while making coffee out of habit rather than desire, that his Aunt Carol approached him with a small wooden box in her hands. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this," she said. "She gave it to me a few weeks ago before things got worse. She said you would know what to do with it when the time was right." Daniel took the box carefully, his hands trembling slightly. It was old, made of dark wood with a small brass latch, the kind of box that had clearly been in the family for generations. He opened it slowly, unsure of what he would find inside. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed slightly with age, along with a small ring that Daniel recognized instantly. It had belonged to his grandmother, a simple gold band with a small pearl embedded in its center. She had worn it every day of his childhood, though she had stopped wearing it in her final years, saying it no longer fit her thinning fingers. He unfolded the letter with careful hands, and his grandmother's familiar handwriting filled the page, steady despite what he knew must have been her weakening strength near the end. The letter spoke of many things, of her hopes for him, of her gratitude for the years they had shared, of her quiet worry that he had closed himself off from love after losing his parents so young, throwing himself into work instead of allowing himself to be vulnerable with another person. And then, near the end of the letter, one line made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. She wrote that she had met someone in her final weeks who reminded her so much of the kind of person she had always hoped he would find. Someone gentle, someone strong, someone who understood loss the way only people who have truly suffered can understand it. She did not write Alina's name directly, but Daniel knew, without a doubt, exactly who she meant. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after reading the letter, the ring resting in his palm, his Aunt Carol quietly leaving the room to give him privacy. Outside, the sky had cleared from yesterday's rain, and pale sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, falling across the old wooden table where he had eaten breakfast every morning of his childhood. He thought about the graveside, about Alina's tears, about the strange certainty that had settled in his chest the moment their eyes had met across the crowd. He thought about his grandmother's words in the letter, about her hope that he would find someone who understood true loss. And slowly, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea so impulsive, and so unlike him that he almost dismissed it immediately. But grief has a way of stripping away hesitation, of making bold things feel suddenly possible. And as Daniel sat there with his grandmother's letter in one hand and her ring in the other, he began to understand what she had truly wanted him to do. He did not know yet how he would find the courage to do it. He did not know that the decision forming in his heart that quiet morning would lead him to make a promise beside an open grave, a promise that would leave him waiting 5 long months for a single message that would change everything. But the seed had been planted, and like all things his grandmother had ever set into motion, it would not be stopped now. Daniel did not remember driving back to the cemetery. One moment he was sitting at his grandmother's kitchen table with the letter and the ring in his hands, and the next he was standing at the gates, his Aunt Carol calling his name from somewhere behind him, confused about why he had turned the car around instead of heading home. He did not stop to explain. He walked past the rows of old headstones, past the small stone angels and the fresh flowers left by other families, until he reached the place where his grandmother had just been buried. The cemetery workers had finished their task. The grave was now a mound of dark, fresh earth, still damp from the morning rain, with a simple wooden marker standing at its head until the real headstone could be placed weeks later. Daniel stood there for a moment, catching his breath, and then he saw her. Alina had not left. She was sitting on a low stone bench a short distance away, her coat pulled tightly around her shoulders, staring at the grave as though she could not make herself walk away from it either. When she saw him approaching, she stood up quickly, wiping at her eyes. "Daniel, is everything all right?" He did not answer right away. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, and the ring in his pocket felt impossibly heavy, as though it carried the full weight of every promise his grandmother had ever made him keep. Behind him, he could hear footsteps, his Aunt Carol and 2 of his cousins following at a cautious distance, unsure of what was happening. "I read her letter," Daniel said finally, his voice unsteady. "She left it for me. She wrote about someone she met in her last weeks, someone who reminded her of everything she hoped I would find one day." Alina's face went pale. "Daniel, I do not know what you are talking about." "She meant you," he said simply. The words hung in the cold afternoon air between them. Alina took a step back, shaking her head slowly, but Daniel closed the distance, pulling the small wooden box from his coat pocket. His hands were trembling now, and he barely recognized his own voice as he continued. "I know this makes no sense. I know we barely know each other outside of the last 6 weeks, and I know grief can make people do foolish things. But my grandmother was never foolish, not once in her entire life. She saw something in you that she wanted me to see too. And standing here, right now, beside her grave, I think I finally understand what she meant." Behind him, his Aunt Carol let out a soft, startled gasp. His cousins exchanged confused glances, whispering to each other, but Daniel did not turn to look at them. His eyes were fixed on Alina, who stood frozen, tears streaming freely down her face now, her hands pressed against her mouth. "Daniel, please," she whispered, "you do not know what you are asking." "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow," he said quickly, opening the small box to reveal his grandmother's ring resting inside. "I am not even asking you to say yes to anything today. I am asking you to let me try. I am asking you to let this be the beginning of something, instead of an ending we walk away from because we are both too afraid to see where it leads." Alina stared at the ring, her chest rising and falling with quick, uneven breaths. The wind picked up around them, scattering a few dry leaves across the fresh grave, and for a long, suspended moment nobody moved. "She called you her bride," came a whisper from behind Daniel. It was his cousin, speaking low to Carol, who shushed her immediately, though her own eyes were wide with disbelief. Daniel reached forward and gently took Alina's hand, the one not covering her mouth, and held it between both of his own. He did not put the ring on her finger. He was not so foolish as to think a woman could be won with grand gestures alone, not after everything she had already lost, though he did not yet know exactly what that meant. He simply held her hand, standing beside the grave of the woman who had brought them together, and spoke the words that would echo through his family for months to come. "I am naming you as the woman I hope to spend my life with," he said, his voice steady now, stripped of all hesitation. "Not because grief has confused me, though I know how it must look, but because for the first time since my parents died, I feel something that is not fear. I feel something that is not loneliness. And I refuse to let that feeling walk away from me, without at least trying to understand it." Alina's shoulders shook as she cried, and for a moment Daniel feared he had made a terrible mistake, that he had frightened her, that his impulsive declaration had crossed some line that could never be uncrossed. But then she squeezed his hand, just slightly, just enough for him to feel it, and she looked up at him with an expression he would spend the next 5 months trying to understand. "You do not know me," she said softly. "Not really. There are things about my life you have never asked about, things I have never told anyone, not even your grandmother, though she came closer to the truth than anyone else ever has." "Then tell me," Daniel said, "whenever you are ready. I am not asking for answers today. I am only asking for a chance." Alina looked past him, at his aunt and cousins standing a respectful distance away, at the fresh grave beside them, at the gray sky above the cemetery. She seemed to be weighing something enormous in her mind, some decision that went far beyond the strange proposal Daniel had just made. Finally, she nodded just once, so slightly that Daniel almost missed it. "I will try," she said. "I cannot promise you anything more than that right now, but I will try." It was not the answer of a woman swept off her feet by romance. It was the answer of someone carrying a weight Daniel could not yet see, though he would come to understand its full shape in the months that followed. But in that moment, standing beside his grandmother's grave with Alina's hand still resting in his own, it was enough. His Aunt Carol approached slowly, her expression a complicated mixture of shock and cautious hope. "Daniel," she said gently, "perhaps this conversation is one you should continue somewhere more private." Daniel nodded, suddenly aware of how strange this scene must look to anyone passing by. A young man kneeling beside a fresh grave with a ring box in his hand, a crying woman standing before him, a small cluster of relatives watching with open mouths. He closed the box carefully and slipped it back into his coat pocket. "Can I drive you somewhere?" he asked Alina. "We do not have to talk about any of this today if you are not ready. I only wanted you to know how I felt before too much time passed, and I lost the courage to say it." Alina wiped her face with the back of her hand and managed a small, uncertain smile, the first genuine smile Daniel had seen from her since they had met weeks earlier at his grandmother's bedside. "I would like that," she said. "I would like to talk, just not here, not standing over her grave." They walked together toward the cemetery gates, leaving Daniel's bewildered relatives behind them, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. Daniel glanced back once at the fresh mound of earth marking his grandmother's resting place, and he felt a strange, quiet certainty settle over him, as if somewhere, somehow, she was watching this unfold exactly as she had hoped it would. He did not know yet that this quiet certainty would be tested in ways he could not imagine. He did not know that the woman walking beside him carried secrets heavy enough to make her disappear entirely, secrets that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a danger he could not see. All he knew, as they reached his car and he opened the door for her, was that something important had begun, something fragile and new, something worth protecting. They drove to a small coffee shop a few miles from the cemetery, one Alina said she used to visit during breaks between her hospice shifts. It was quiet at this hour, only a handful of other customers scattered among the tables, and they found a corner booth near the window where the afternoon light fell soft and gray through the glass. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Alina wrapped her hands around a cup of tea she had barely touched, staring down at the swirling steam as though it might offer her the right words. Daniel waited, resisting the urge to fill the silence, sensing that whatever she needed to say required time he was willing to give her. "My brother Simon and I grew up without much," Alina said finally, her voice quiet but steady. "Our parents struggled financially for most of our childhood, and by the time I was old enough to work, I understood exactly how fragile everything could be. One missed payment, One bad decision, it could unravel an entire family. Daniel listened carefully, saying nothing, letting her continue at her own pace. Simon made some bad decisions a few years ago, she continued. He borrowed money from people he should never have trusted, people who do not simply let debts disappear when circumstances become difficult. I have spent the last 2 years trying to help him manage what he owes, trying to keep our family safe from consequences I am not always able to control. Is that why you cried so hard at the funeral? Daniel asked gently. Is Simon connected to my grandmother somehow? Alina shook her head quickly. No, nothing like that. Your grandmother had nothing to do with Simon's troubles. I cried because she was the first person in a very long time who made me feel like my life could be more than just managing crisis after crisis. She listened to me the way no one else has, not since my own grandmother passed away. She gave me permission to imagine a different kind of future, even while she herself was dying. Daniel reached across the table and gently took her hand again, the same way he had beside the grave, though this time there was no urgency in the gesture, only quiet reassurance. Whatever is happening with your brother, you do not have to face it alone, not anymore. Alina looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to determine whether he truly understood what he was offering. You say that now, she said softly, but you do not know how complicated this can become. There are people in Simon's life who do not simply go away when you ask them to. People who make promises of their own, promises that are far less gentle than the one you made me today. A chill passed through Daniel's chest at her words, though he did his best not to let it show on his face. Are you in danger, Alina? She hesitated, glancing toward the window, watching the gray afternoon light fade slowly toward evening. I do not know, she admitted. I have managed to keep myself separate from most of it, but Simon has been making poor choices again recently, and I am afraid of what that might mean for both of us. Daniel wanted to ask more, wanted to understand exactly what danger she was describing, but something in her expression told him she had already shared more than she was comfortable sharing for one day. Instead, he simply held her hand a little tighter and said the only thing he could think to say. Whatever happens, I meant what I said today. I am not asking you to solve everything right now. I am only asking you to let me stand beside you while you figure it out. Alina's eyes filled with fresh tears, though this time they seemed to carry something closer to gratitude than grief. Nobody has ever said that to me before, she whispered. They sat together in that small coffee shop until the evening light disappeared entirely, talking quietly about smaller things now. About Daniel's childhood with his grandmother, about Alina's years working in hospice care, about the strange and unexpected way their lives had become tangled together over the illness and death of a woman who had somehow seen a future neither of them had been brave enough to imagine on their own. By the time Daniel finally drove her home, dropping her off outside a modest apartment building on the edge of the city, something had shifted between them, something fragile but undeniably real. He did not know, as he watched her walk up the steps to her building and disappear inside, that this quiet, hopeful evening would be one of the last uncomplicated moments they would share for a very long time. He did not know that the shadow she had only hinted at, the shadow of her brother's dangerous debts, was already spreading further than either of them understood. All he knew, driving home alone through the darkened streets, was that for the first time since burying the only parent he had ever truly known, he felt something other than grief settling into his chest. He felt hope, and he had no idea yet how expensive that hope was about to become. Weeks passed slowly after that first evening in the coffee shop, though to Daniel they felt like the beginning of an entirely different life. He and Alina spoke on the phone most evenings, their conversations growing longer and easier each time, filled with the small discoveries that come with getting to know someone new. He learned that she hummed old songs under her breath while cooking, that she was terrified of large dogs despite loving small ones, that she had wanted to become a doctor once but had chosen nursing instead because it felt more immediate, more directly connected to the people she was trying to help. She learned things about him too, that he still kept his grandmother's reading glasses on his nightstand, unable to move them anywhere else. That he had thrown himself into his work as an architect largely to avoid sitting alone with his grief after his parents died. That he had never told anyone, not even his closest friends, how frightened he still was of losing the people he loved. They met for dinner twice during those weeks, quiet meals at small restaurants where they talked for hours, careful not to move too quickly, both of them aware of the strange and unusual beginning their relationship had taken. Alina never brought up her brother Simon again during these meetings, and Daniel, sensing her reluctance, did not push the subject, though the memory of her words at the coffee shop lingered uneasily in the back of his mind. It was during their third dinner together, nearly a month after the funeral, that Daniel noticed a change in her. She seemed distracted throughout the meal, glancing frequently at her phone, her responses to his questions shorter and more distant than usual. When he asked if something was wrong, she offered only a tired smile and a vague explanation about a difficult day at work. He did not press her further that evening, though a quiet unease had begun to settle in his chest, one he could not quite name. He drove her home as usual, and as she stepped out of the car, she turned back to him with an expression he would replay in his memory countless times over the following months. "Thank you for being patient with me," she said softly. "You have given me something I did not expect to find again. I hope you know that." "I am not going anywhere," Daniel said, smiling. "Whatever is worrying you, we will figure it out together." Alina nodded, though her eyes carried a sadness that seemed disconnected from anything they had discussed that evening. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek gently, a small gesture that felt both intimate and strangely final, though Daniel did not recognize it as such at the time. "Good night, Daniel," she whispered. He watched her walk up the steps to her apartment building one last time, waving as she reached the door before disappearing inside. He drove home that night feeling lighter than he had in weeks, already looking forward to their next conversation, already planning the questions he wanted to ask her about her childhood, about her dreams for the future, about the life he was beginning to imagine they might build together. He had no idea that this would be the last time he saw her for 5 long months. The next morning, Daniel called her as he always did, expecting to hear her familiar voice answer on the second or third ring. Instead, the call went straight to an automated message informing him that the number was no longer in service. He frowned, assuming there had been some mistake, some technical error with his phone, and tried again an hour later with the same result. By the afternoon, his concern had grown into something closer to alarm. He drove to her apartment building, climbing the familiar steps he had watched her disappear behind only the night before, and knocked firmly on her door. There was no answer. He knocked again, calling her name softly, aware of how strange he must have looked to any neighbors passing by. An elderly woman emerged from the apartment next door, eyeing him with cautious curiosity. "Are you looking for the young woman who lived there?" she asked. "Yes," Daniel said quickly. "Alina, do you know where she is?" The woman shook her head slowly. "She moved out early this morning. Movers came before sunrise, if you can believe that, loaded up everything in less than 2 hours. I have never seen anyone leave so quickly." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him, a cold, sinking dread spreading through his chest. Did she say where she was going? Did she leave any message, anything at all? "I am sorry, dear," the woman said gently. "She did not speak to anyone. She looked frightened, if I am being honest, frightened and in a great hurry." Daniel stood in the empty hallway for a long moment after the woman retreated back into her apartment, staring at the closed door that had, until yesterday, belonged to Alina. He thought about her words the night before, about the sadness in her eyes as she said good night, about the strange finality of her kiss on his cheek. He thought about her brother Simon, about the dangerous people she had mentioned so briefly at the coffee shop weeks earlier, about the shadow she had never fully explained. Something terrible had happened. He was certain of it. And now, standing alone outside her empty apartment with no way to reach her, no way to even begin understanding what had driven her away so suddenly, Daniel Hart began the longest and most painful wait of his entire life. He did not yet know that it would take 5 months, countless dead ends, and a discovery more frightening than he could have imagined before he would hear her voice again. Daniel spent the first 2 weeks after Alina's disappearance in a state of restless disbelief, convinced there had to be some simple explanation he was simply failing to see. He called every hospital and hospice agency in the city, hoping to find a record of her transferring to a new position, but no one had heard from her since her sudden resignation, submitted by email the same morning she had vanished. He visited the coffee shop where they had shared their first honest conversation, half hoping to find her sitting in their usual corner booth, but the booth remained empty every time. His friend Oliver, who had known him since university, grew increasingly worried watching Daniel unravel over the following weeks. "You barely knew her, Daniel," Oliver said one evening, sitting across from him at Daniel's kitchen table, the same table where his grandmother's letter had once rested. "I understand the connection felt real, but people disappear sometimes. Maybe she was not ready for what happened at the cemetery. Maybe it frightened her away." "It was not fear of me," Daniel insisted, though even as he said it, he could not fully explain how he knew this with such certainty. "Something happened to her, something dangerous. She mentioned her brother owed money to people who do not simply forgive debts. I think she is running from something, not from me." Oliver studied his friend carefully, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to argue further. "Then, what are you going to do?" "You cannot chase a ghost forever, Daniel. At some point you have to consider that she may never come back, regardless of the reason." Daniel did not answer immediately. He thought about his grandmother's letter, about the certainty in her handwriting when she had written about the woman she hoped he would find. He thought about the way Alina had looked at him beside the grave, the fear and hope tangled together in her eyes as she had agreed to try. None of it felt like the beginning of something that was meant to end this way, abandoned and unfinished before it had even truly begun. "I am going to find her," he said finally. "I do not know how yet. But I am not going to simply let this go." Oliver sighed but said nothing more, recognizing the stubborn determination in his friend's voice, the same determination that had carried Daniel through the loss of his parents, and, more recently, through the loss of his grandmother. It was a determination Oliver had learned not to argue with. Even when he privately worried, it was leading his friend toward heartbreak rather than resolution. Over the following weeks, Daniel began a quiet investigation of his own, though he possessed none of the skills or resources of a professional. He spoke to former coworkers of Alina's at the hospice agency, most of whom knew little beyond her professional reputation as a dedicated and compassionate nurse. One coworker, a woman named Grace who had worked alongside Alina for nearly 3 years, agreed to meet him for coffee, though she seemed hesitant from the moment she sat down. "Alina kept her personal life very private," Grace admitted, stirring her coffee slowly. "I knew she had a brother, and I knew there had been some kind of family trouble over the years, but she never shared details. She was the kind of person who listened to everyone else's problems and rarely spoke about her own." "Did she ever mention feeling unsafe? Did she ever talk about being afraid of anyone?" Daniel asked, leaning forward. Grace hesitated, glancing around the coffee shop as though checking for anyone who might overhear. "There was one afternoon, a few months before your grandmother passed, when Alina came to work with a bruise on her arm. She said she had fallen, but I did not entirely believe her. She seemed shaken for the rest of that day, distracted in a way I had never seen from her before." Daniel's stomach tightened at these words, a cold dread settling deeper into his chest. "Do you know anything about her brother? His name, where he lives, anything at all?" Grace shook her head slowly. "I am sorry, she never spoke his name to me. All I know is that whatever trouble he was involved in seemed to weigh on her heavily, especially in her final months at the agency." Daniel thanked her for her time, though he left the coffee shop with more questions than answers, the small fragments of information only deepening his fear rather than resolving it. He spent that evening searching online for any public record connected to Alina Marsh, finding little beyond an old university transcript and a handful of professional nursing credentials. There was no trace of her brother Simon anywhere, no address, no phone number, nothing that might lead him closer to understanding what had truly happened. Weeks stretched into a full month, then 2, and Daniel's search grew increasingly desperate and increasingly fruitless. He hired a private investigator using savings he had set aside for a home renovation project, a decision Oliver questioned but ultimately supported, recognizing that his friend needed to exhaust every possible avenue before he could begin to accept whatever answer eventually came. The investigator, a quiet and methodical man named Peter Doyle, spent nearly 3 weeks tracing whatever fragments of information he could find. He confirmed that Alina had closed her bank accounts the same morning she had vanished, transferring whatever funds she possessed to an account that could not be easily traced. He discovered that her brother Simon had a minor criminal record involving unpaid debts and an assault charge that had later been dropped due to insufficient evidence, though the details of the incident remained unclear. Whoever Simon owed money to, Peter explained during one of their meetings, they are not the kind of people who simply write off a debt when it becomes difficult to collect. Based on what I have found, I believe your friend Alina may have left the city entirely, possibly to protect herself, possibly to protect you as well, if she believed staying nearby might put you at risk. The words struck Daniel with unexpected force. He had spent weeks assuming Alina's disappearance was driven purely by her own fear, her own need to escape whatever danger surrounded her brother. He had not fully considered that she might have vanished partly to protect him, to keep the danger surrounding her family from ever reaching his doorstep. "Can you find her?" Daniel asked, his voice tight with a mixture of hope and desperation. Peter shook his head slowly. "I have exhausted every lead I currently have access to. If she has deliberately disappeared, and it certainly appears that way, she has done so with considerable skill. I am sorry, Daniel. I do not believe I can find her without more information than I currently possess." Daniel sat in silence for a long moment after Peter left, staring at the small stack of documents the investigator had compiled. Documents that told him almost nothing except that the woman he had promised himself to beside his grandmother's grave had vanished so completely it was as though she had never existed at all. That night, alone in his apartment, Daniel opened the small wooden box that still held his grandmother's ring, the same ring he had never had the chance to place on Alina's finger. He turned it slowly in his fingers, remembering the certainty in his grandmother's letter, the quiet confidence with which she had written about the future she hoped he would find. "I do not understand," he whispered into the empty apartment, as though his grandmother might somehow hear him. "You told me to trust this. You told me this was right. So why does it feel like I have lost her before I ever truly had her?" There was no answer, of course, only the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside his window. But Daniel closed the box carefully and placed it on his nightstand, beside his grandmother's old reading glasses, refusing to let go of the strange and stubborn hope that had carried him this far. He did not know it yet, but somewhere across the country, in a small town she had never mentioned to anyone in her old life, Alina was fighting a battle of her own, one that had nothing to do with whether she loved him and everything to do with whether she could ever return to him safely. The months that followed Daniel's failed search stretched out before him like an endless gray corridor, each day nearly indistinguishable from the last. He returned to his architectural work with a kind of grim determination, throwing himself into blueprints and building projects the same way he had after his parents' deaths years earlier, using labor as a shield against the ache of unanswered questions. His friends grew concerned, watching him retreat further into himself. Oliver invited him out regularly, dragging him to dinners and gatherings where Daniel sat quietly, present in body but clearly elsewhere in mind. His coworkers noticed the change too, the way his easy laughter had grown rare, the way he stayed later at the office than necessary, avoiding the empty silence of his apartment for as long as possible each evening. His Aunt Carol called him often during those months, gently probing about how he was managing, careful never to bring up Alina directly unless Daniel raised the subject himself. When he finally did, nearly 3 months after the disappearance, His aunt listened patiently as he recounted every detail of his failed investigation, every dead end, every fragment of information that led nowhere. "Your grandmother believed in her," Carol said softly, once Daniel had finished. "I do not think she was wrong to believe in her, Daniel. But sometimes the people we are meant to love carry burdens we cannot see clearly, burdens that take time to resolve, even when every part of us wants to rush toward a happy ending." "What if she never resolves it?" Daniel asked, his voice raw with an exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. "What if I spend the rest of my life wondering what happened to her, never knowing if she is safe, never knowing if she thinks about me at all?" Carol reached across the table and took his hand, the same gentle gesture his grandmother used to offer him during difficult moments throughout his childhood. "Then you will have loved someone bravely, even if it cost you pain. That is never something to regret, no matter how it ends." Daniel nodded, though her words offered only small comfort against the enormous weight of uncertainty that had settled over his life. He began attending a small grief support group during his 4th month of waiting, initially reluctant, but eventually finding some measure of solace in speaking honestly about his layered losses. His parents, his grandmother, and now Alina, whose absence felt like its own particular kind of grief, made sharper by the lack of any clear ending. It was during one of these sessions that a woman named Grace approached him after the meeting concluded, and Daniel realized with some surprise that it was the same Grace who had once worked alongside Alina at the hospice agency. She explained that she had begun attending the group after losing her own mother earlier that year, and upon recognizing Daniel, she had hesitated for weeks before finally deciding to speak with him. "I have thought about you often since we spoke that day," Grace admitted. "I wanted you to know that I have not heard anything from Alina either, but I did learn something recently that might interest you. One of our former colleagues mentioned that Alina's brother Simon was involved in some kind of serious legal trouble a few months back, something involving significant debt to people connected to organized lending outside the usual legal channels. I do not know the details, but it seems to align with what you told me about her fears." Daniel absorbed this information carefully, feeling the familiar mixture of hope and dread that had accompanied every small fragment of news over the past months. "Do you know if he was arrested? Do you know where he might be now?" Grace shook her head apologetically. "I only heard second-hand information, nothing concrete enough to act on. I am sorry I cannot offer more than that." Despite the vagueness of the information, Daniel found himself unable to let it go. He spent the following weeks searching court records across several nearby states, looking for any case involving a man named Simon Marsh, cross-referencing dates and locations with whatever fragments of Alina's history he had managed to piece together over the preceding months. It was slow, painstaking work, made more difficult by the fact that Simon's name was common enough to generate countless irrelevant results. Finally, in the early days of his 5th month of waiting, Daniel discovered a small newspaper article from a town several states away, describing a minor legal proceeding involving a man matching Simon's description, accused of failing to repay a substantial private loan. The article was brief, offering little detail beyond the man's name and the general nature of the case, but it was more than Daniel had uncovered in months of searching. He considered traveling to the town immediately, driven by a desperate need to finally have answers, but something held him back. A quiet instinct that told him rushing forward without more information might do more harm than good, particularly if Alina truly believed her absence was necessary to protect him. Instead, he wrote everything down carefully, adding it to the growing collection of fragments he had gathered, and continued waiting, though the waiting had grown no easier with time. Late one evening, nearly 5 months to the day since Alina's disappearance, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at his phone as he had done countless times before, half expecting nothing, as he had trained himself to expect after so many months of silence. He was preparing to set the phone aside and attempt sleep, exhausted from another long day at work, when the screen suddenly illuminated with an incoming message from an unfamiliar number. His heart stopped for a moment as he read the words on the screen, simple and urgent, carrying no explanation, no apology, nothing beyond a request that made his hands begin to tremble. "Daniel, it is Alina. Please meet me tomorrow. I will explain everything. I am sorry it took so long." He read the message 3 times before he could fully believe it was real, his mind racing through 5 months of fear and uncertainty, condensed suddenly into these few simple sentences glowing on his phone screen. He did not sleep at all that night, sitting instead in his living room with the message open before him, rereading it over and over as though the words might disappear if he looked away for too long. Tomorrow he would finally have his answers. Tomorrow, after 5 months of silence, he would see her again. But as the night stretched on and dawn slowly began to break outside his window, Daniel could not shake the quiet fear that whatever explanation awaited him might change everything he thought he understood about the promise they had made beside his grandmother's grave, and about the fragile, uncertain future that promise had set into motion. Alina had chosen a small park on the edge of the city, a quiet place with a wooden bench overlooking a pond where ducks drifted lazily across the still water. Daniel arrived nearly half an hour early, unable to sit still in his apartment any longer, his mind cycling through 1,000 possible explanations for her disappearance, none of which felt adequate to justify 5 months of silence, yet all of which he found himself desperately hoping might be true, if only because they would mean she had never stopped caring. He saw her before she saw him, walking slowly along the path toward the bench, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the mild morning weather, her eyes scanning the park nervously as though checking to see if anyone had followed her. Her hair was different, cut shorter than he remembered, and there was a thinness to her face that spoke of months of stress he could only begin to imagine. But it was undeniably her, and the sight of her walking toward him after so long sent a wave of emotion through Daniel so powerful, he had to grip the edge of the bench to steady himself. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Daniel," she said softly, "thank you for coming." "I would have come no matter where you asked," he replied, standing slowly. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her into an embrace that had been 5 months in the making, but something in her guarded posture held him back. "Alina, what happened? Where have you been?" She lowered herself onto the bench, gesturing for him to sit beside her, though she kept a careful distance between them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I need you to understand something before I explain everything," she said. "Leaving the way I did was the hardest decision I have ever made. I thought about you every single day. I am not exaggerating when I say that." "Then why?" Daniel asked, unable to keep the frustration from his voice, though he softened it as quickly as it emerged, reminding himself of the fear he had heard in her voice weeks before her disappearance, the shadow she had only briefly described. "Why did you leave without a word, without any way for me to reach you?" Alina took a deep breath, staring out at the pond for a long moment before she began to speak. "My brother Simon borrowed a significant amount of money from a man named Victor Cole several years ago, long before I ever met your grandmother. Victor is not the kind of man who operates through normal legal channels. He lends money to people desperate enough to accept his terms, and he collects debts through methods that have nothing to do with courts or contracts." Daniel felt a familiar chill settle over him, the same dread he had experienced months earlier when Grace first mentioned Alina's bruised arm. "Did he hurt you?" "He threatened me," Alina admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "The night before I disappeared, Victor's associates came to my apartment. They told me Simon had missed another payment, that the debt had grown too large to ignore any longer, and that if Simon could not pay what he owed, they would begin looking for other ways to collect. They mentioned you specifically, Daniel. They knew about the funeral. They knew about the promise you made me beside your grandmother's grave. They made it very clear that anyone close to me could become a target if Simon's debt remained unpaid." Daniel's blood ran cold at these words, the full weight of what Alina had sacrificed finally beginning to settle over him. "You left to protect me." "I left to protect both of us," Alina said. "I could not stay near you knowing that my presence might put you in danger. I closed my accounts, changed my number, and disappeared as completely as I could manage, hoping that if Victor's people could not find me, they would eventually lose interest in pursuing Simon's debt through people connected to me. "Where did you go?" Daniel asked. "I stayed with a distant cousin in another state for the first 2 months," Alina explained. "After that, I moved several more times, never staying anywhere long enough to establish a pattern anyone could trace. I worked small jobs under a different name, sent whatever money I could spare to help Simon negotiate a payment plan with Victor's associates, and prayed every single day that this would eventually end." "Did it end?" Daniel asked, though he could see from the tension still visible in her shoulders that the answer was not entirely reassuring. Alina nodded slowly. 3 weeks ago, Simon finally managed to settle the debt in full, using money he earned through a new job combined with a loan from our aunt, who had no idea how serious the situation had become until Simon finally confessed everything to her. Victor confirmed the debt was cleared through a mutual associate. "I have spent the past 3 weeks trying to verify that this was truly the end of it before I allowed myself to reach out to you, terrified that if I was wrong, I would only be placing you in danger all over again." Daniel sat in stunned silence for a long moment, absorbing everything Alina had just revealed. 5 months of fear and uncertainty on his end had been mirrored by 5 months of far greater danger and sacrifice on hers, a burden she had carried entirely alone rather than risk pulling him into it. "You should have told me," he said finally, though his voice carried no anger, only a deep and aching sadness. "I would have helped you find a way through this together. You did not have to disappear completely to keep me safe." "I know that now," Alina admitted, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "But in that moment, standing in my apartment with Victor's men making threats I could not ignore, disappearing felt like the only way to guarantee your safety. I was not thinking clearly enough to consider that there might have been another path forward. I only knew that I could not risk something happening to you because of choices my brother had made." Daniel reached across the small distance between them and gently took her hand, the same hand he had held 5 months earlier beside his grandmother's grave. "I understand why you made the choice you did," he said softly. "I cannot say it did not hurt because it did more than I can fully explain, but I understand it came from love, not from a lack of it." Alina looked up at him, searching his face with an expression that mixed hope and disbelief in equal measure. "You are not angry with me." "I was angry," Daniel admitted honestly. "For months I was angry and confused and heartbroken all at once. But sitting here now, hearing what you actually went through, I cannot imagine loving you any less because of it. If anything, I find myself loving you more, knowing what you were willing to sacrifice to keep me safe." A quiet sob escaped Alina's throat, and this time Daniel did not hold back. He pulled her gently into his arms, and she came willingly, burying her face against his shoulder as 5 months of accumulated fear and exhaustion finally found release. They sat together on the small park bench for a long while, the ducks drifting undisturbed across the pond before them, neither of them speaking, simply allowing the weight of everything they had both endured to settle quietly between them. "What happens now?" Alina finally asked, pulling back slightly to look at him, her eyes still glistening with tears but carrying something new now, something closer to cautious hope. Daniel reached into his coat pocket, where he had carried the small wooden box every single day since her disappearance, unable to leave it behind even when hope had felt impossibly distant. He opened it slowly, revealing his grandmother's ring resting inside exactly where it had waited for 5 long months. "Now," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion swelling in his chest, "I finish what I started beside her grave. Not because grief is confusing me this time, and not because I am rushing toward something neither of us understands, but because 5 months of silence taught me exactly how much I do not want to live without you, and because I believe, more certainly than ever, that my grandmother saw something true when she brought us together." Alina stared at the ring, then at Daniel, her hands trembling as she brought them to her mouth, overwhelmed by the moment unfolding before her. "Daniel, are you sure? After everything that happened, after everything I put you through?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he said. "I do not need more time to know what I already know. I love you, Alina. I loved you the moment I saw you crying at that funeral, though I did not understand it then. I loved you through every day of your absence, even when I feared I might never see you again. And I love you now, sitting here beside this pond, having finally heard the truth about everything you sacrificed for me. Alina laughed through her tears, a sound of pure relief and joy that Daniel had not realized he had been waiting 5 months to hear. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Daniel, I will marry you. He slipped the ring gently onto her finger, his hand steady despite the overwhelming emotion coursing through him, and for a long moment, they simply sat together on the small park bench, her hand resting in his, the ring catching the soft morning light between them. It was not the dramatic promise he had made beside an open grave 5 months earlier, delivered in a moment of grief and impulsive certainty. It was something steadier now, something built on truth rather than desperate hope, forged through 5 months of separation that had tested and ultimately confirmed exactly how deeply they had come to care for one another. Your grandmother would be so happy right now, Alina said softly, resting her head against his shoulder. She already knew, Daniel replied, smiling as he thought back to her letter, to the quiet certainty in her handwriting. She saw this coming long before either of us did. They remained on that bench until the sun climbed higher above the park, watching the ducks glide peacefully across the water, both of them finally allowing themselves to imagine a future neither had dared to hope for during the long, uncertain months that had separated them. There would still be much to navigate in the days ahead, conversations with Simon, careful steps to ensure Victor Cole's threats truly belonged to the past, and the slow, patient work of building trust after such a painful separation. But for the first time in 5 months, neither of them faced that future alone. In the weeks that followed their reunion, Daniel introduced Alina properly to the rest of his family, watching with quiet satisfaction as his Aunt Carol embraced her warmly, recognizing immediately the same qualities in her that Margaret Hart had seen so clearly in her final weeks. Simon, humbled by the consequences of his choices, met Daniel cautiously at first, though his gratitude toward the man who had waited so patiently for his sister was evident in every careful word he spoke. They visited Margaret's grave together one quiet afternoon in early autumn, the headstone finally in place, engraved with the simple words she had chosen for herself years earlier. Alina knelt beside the grave, placing a small bouquet of flowers against the stone, while Daniel stood behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Thank you," Alina whispered to the grave, "for seeing something in me I could not yet see in myself." Daniel knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. She always did have a gift for seeing exactly what people needed, long before they understood it themselves. They stayed at the grave for a long while that afternoon, not out of grief this time, but out of gratitude, honoring the woman whose final act of love had set into motion the most unexpected and transformative chapter of both their lives. The wedding, when it finally came the following spring, was small and quiet, held in the same garden where Margaret had spent so many peaceful afternoons during her final years, surrounded by family who had watched this unlikely love story unfold from its strange and painful beginning to its hard-won, hopeful conclusion. Daniel often thought, in the years that followed, about how strange it was that the deepest joy of his life had grown from the depths of his greatest grief, planted quite literally beside an open grave, tested through 5 months of silence and fear, and finally blossomed into something steady and true. He understood now what his grandmother had meant in the final weeks of her life, when she had told him that some things fall into place exactly when they are supposed to. He had waited 5 months for a single message. It had been the longest wait of his life, filled with fear and uncertainty he had never expected to survive. But standing years later in the quiet garden where he had married Alina, watching her laugh with his Aunt Carol while their young daughter chased butterflies across the grass, Daniel understood with complete certainty that every difficult day of that waiting had been worth it, every single time. Because some promises, made even in the depths of grief beside an open grave, turn out to be the truest promises of all.